So actually, I was planning to introduce myself, but actually that was done already. So you know my background and some slides of my past works. I co-edited with together with two other colleagues a digital histories book a couple of years back, and it's open access. Then I have also written about Yves Montagn's tour in the Soviet Union together with Hannu Salmi and Bruce Johnson. And I have been working also at the Oceanic Exchanges Project, and I see that some of the colleagues with whom I have been working at this project, such as Jana Kek, are also in the audience. So I'm very happy to see that this work is going on. And so in this Oceanic Exchanges Project, we studied circulation of 19th century news in the press globally. And then, as mentioned also earlier, I have been studying some of the kind of like circulation of pseudo-historical narratives in the Russian language internet, basically, focusing on kind of like medievalist discussions and the kind of like birth of Rus. But this is something that I'm not going to talk to you about today. But I will talk to you about my present work, that is the Soviet newsreels. Newsreels are, of course, a historical phenomenon, and not everybody knows what they are or where. So basically, newsreels were approximately 10 minutes long news films that were shown in the cinemas before the actual feature of the evening in the cinemas. So their regular production started in the 1910s, and that spread widely very fast. And especially in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, they were produced and shown all over the world. By the end of 1960s or early 70s, their production ceased in many countries, for instance, in Western European countries and the US. But for instance, in the Eastern Bloc countries, such as Soviet Union, the production continued until the 1990s. Basically because there was this state support, and they didn't have commercials to show before the films, so they would show propaganda newsreels. And today's talk, and actually all the three case studies that I'm going to talk to you about, are based on one particular data set that is a newsreel series titled Novosti Dня, or News of the Day. That was the main newsreel series produced in the Soviet Union after the Second World War. So you can think about this newsreel series as the Pravda of the newsreel. So this was kind of like the central one, and it was produced by the Central Documentary Film Studios in Moscow. Altogether, in this collection, we have approximately 1,700 newsreel issues that we are studying, and their duration is approximately 8 minutes for each of them. I'm not doing this alone. I have been collaborating with several colleagues. Most of these are from Cultural Data Analytics Lab Kudan at Tallinn University, but also from King's College and elsewhere. So I don't want to claim that everything that I will show is not only my work. So this work requires a bunch of other people as well. So why do I study audiovisual materials? So as a cultural historian, I'm actually not so interested in film or film styles as I would probably be if I was a film scholar. But I'm studying audiovisual materials as traces of past cultural, technological, and information spreading activities. So I'm kind of like interested in trying to trace the kind of like history behind these materials or these traces of the past. And what I'm trying to kind of like understand constantly is kind of like, how can we actually understand and get to the phenomenon behind historical audiovisual materials and do that computationally? As you can see, I'm working with quite a large data set, so doing this qualitatively and manually would not be possible here. The research interests, particularly related to this data set, are kind of like temporal changes of representations of the world in Soviet newsreels. So this material was very tightly steered by the Soviet officials. So it's kind of like pure propaganda material, but it also kind of represents the ways the Soviet officials wanted to portray the world to the audiences in the Soviet Union. And it is thus possible to, so if there are changes, it means that there was a deliberate kind of like need to change this, because they were really kind of like carefully crafted materials, and nothing appears accidentally in these materials. So for doing this, I have been using machine learning and artificial intelligence in combination with other methods that you will see soon. And in this talk, I will be focusing on 3 examples, as already mentioned. One of them, I will be talking about kind of like how to trace temporal dynamics in multimodal historical data, meaning audiovisual materials. Then I will switch to looking at temporal dynamics of purely visual discourses. So then we will look only at visual parts, and we will continue looking at the visual part also in the third case study, where I will be talking about detecting and measuring cultural political phenomena with large language models. And there is a question mark still, because this is an ongoing work. So let's see where it will actually lead us. Okay, so I will now start the first case study, the temporal dynamics of multimodal historical data. So this is based on this article that we published together with my colleagues in April, a framework for the analysis of historical newsreels. And here, the kind of like the starting point is the notion that when we study historical audiovisual data that has been digitized, there are multitude of different kinds of levels or layers that we need to take into account. First of all, as we are talking about audiovisual data, it is of course multimodal. There is a moving image, there is spoken word, there is music, certain gestures, iconographies, different kinds of like dynamics or speed, production crews, surrounding context, and so on. All of these take part in creating the meaning of the film that we are seeing. Simultaneously, as we are talking about digitized historical data, there are also temporal layers involved here. So there is, of course, this temporal layer of production when the film actually was produced, but then there is the distribution, then we have the archiving time, then we have digitizing, and also kind of like the temporally changing context in all of these. So all of this can be kind of like, it is maybe easier intuitively to take into account when I'm studying audiovisual materials, kind of like manually or kind of like qualitatively. But how do we take all of these into account when we do computational analysis is kind of like the pressing question in this study. So the research question here is how to study the temporal dynamics of content, production, and dissemination in large scale and long-term audiovisual news data so that we maintain also the understanding of this multimodality here. For this study, I did kind of like quite extensive literature review on different types of research streams that are related to computational research of historical heritage or like historical audiovisual materials. So, for instance, in qualitative film history, it is quite evident that they are very good at taking this multimodality into account. They to take the historical context into account and so on. But there is always this limited scale and hard, it's very hard to compare different studies with each other. On the other hand, if we look at computational video analysis, that is, of course, there is a large scale, it is usually systematic and it is quite easy to compare results from different studies. But then there is limited multimodality, there are no debates really on meaning and kind of like no discussions on historical context. So as I was kind of like going through these different research streams, I started to think that actually what we should try to do is to kind of like take all the good parts of each of these research streams and try to put them together and try to see how can would this be actually a way to be able to study multimodal audiovisual materials in large scale, but simultaneously maintaining this understanding of historical context and multimodality. So this is what what we were trying to do here, kind of like put all of this together and to combine all the strengths into kind of like a generic pipeline. So we came up with a pipeline, and this, of course, resembles very much kind of like basic data analytics pipeline, but there are some additional points here that we have added to kind of like in order to have this multimodality and historical layers in the pipeline as well. So the pipeline or our additions to the pipeline are detecting and pairing meaning-making units and variables, temporal layers of digitized heritage data, and merging results of quantitative analysis of different layers. I know it sounds tricky, but I'll try to explain this in a minute. So when I talk about detecting and pairing meaning-making units and variables, I mean that when we start to study a historical phenomenon by using certain digital materials, it is, of course, very important to think about what actually this phenomenon that I'm interested in consists of, and not just to kind of like they take the first field in metadata and start analyzing that without actually thinking how this particular element is related to the phenomenon that I'm interested in. So for this, we did also kind of like this literature review on qualitative historical studies on newsreels and tried to see which elements in these studies are kind of like stated as being important in meaning making in audiovisual materials and particularly in historical newsreels. So here you can see, you probably can't see very well, but there are kind of like certain meaning-making units are kind of like mentioned in almost each study, and then there are some more rare elements or units that are kind of like mentioned only by a couple of authors. So we took these meaning-making units and then we compared them with the data that we have, both containing metadata and also thinking about if there are some things that we can actually extract from the videos as well. And kind of like matching these meaning-making units and variables in the data, we actually then could see what are the elements that we think that make actually meaning in the newsreels, but also one needs to be realistic and to see what you actually have, what kinds of like metadata points, for instance, you can actually use. So pairing these gives you some kind of like an understanding what you can actually study there. So that's what we did. So we kind of like paired these and understood that there are kind of like 4 different kinds of levels within this data that we can actually study kind of like across the years. So we focused on cinematic and topic trends, visual characteristics, cities, and crew compositions. I will show you them to you in a minute. But before that, I will talk a little bit about these temporal layers of the digitized heritage data. I believe that this is kind of like self-evident to this audience here. I don't need to tell any historian how important it is to actually to practice source criticism and to think about who has produced it and in what circumstances. But this is something that is not self-evident in many other disciplines. And I think that this is something that we need to bring in to the more kind of like broader digital or digital humanities research. So kind of like to also with digitized materials, it is very important to think about how the data was formed and by whom, who wrote the metadata based on what kinds of like materials and whose traces I'm actually reading. These visualizations that I have here in this slide are quite revealing. The one on the top, each blue dot represents one newsreel issue. And as you can see, starting from 1954, I have quite systematic kind of like amount of newsreels per each year, which makes me quite sure that we have almost all of the newsreels from that period. But if you look at the immediate post-war period, you actually realize that we have very scarce material from that period. And kind of like based on the readings and on my experience on Russian archives, I assume that this is somehow related to de-Stalinization of the archival materials and especially audiovisual materials after Stalin's death. So either they have been completely destroyed or they have been hidden somewhere so that kind of like not to reveal like the extent of Stalinism and so on. So, but this is of course when I start to analyze like the visuals or anything, this is important for me to understand that what is missing in the data. The visualization below is also very interesting in that sense that we were first very excited when we got this. So this is kind of like based on metadata and standard deviation of durations between annotations. So for each newsreel issue, there is kind of like certain textual descriptions. For some of them there is more, and for some of them there is less. And basically this kind of like shows the dynamics and standard deviation there. So first we thought that, yeah, we found something interesting, but then we understood that this is actually shows basically how active the digitizers have been in inserting the metadata points there. So this kind of like shows something, but it doesn't show anything about the actual film materials from the time, but this shows more of the activities of the digitization itself. So it is important to think about whose traces I'm actually reading here and whether that's important for my study or not. And yeah, now about the merging results of quantitative analysis. So first, of course, we did some kind of like quantitative analysis of these selected variables. So we focused first on cinematic and topic trends, meaning we extracted kind of like shots by shot detectors, and then we have been looking at the textual descriptions of the metadata of the newsreel contents, and kind of like got some interesting insights on the kind of like what were the kind of like stable features there, and what kinds of like different dynamics we could see there as well. Then we looked at visual characteristics. I will talk about this method more in a minute, but we basically could see that there are certain kind of like interesting visual clusters in this newsreel data that kind of like is dominant here. Then we looked at C-dimensions. This was based on metadata, textual descriptions of the newsreels in metadata, where we extracted the C-dimensions, and then we calculated over and under representations of cities. So these are kind of like certain visualizations of that and temporal dynamics shown here. We have just recently published a preprint together with my colleagues, where we kind of like dig deeper into this and produced a kind of like framework for quantifying bias in different historical data sets. Here we are using this example of C-dimensions in the Soviet audiovisual propaganda. And then we looked at the crew compositions. So we had this data of film directors and cinematographers, and we did this automatic gender detection. And then we looked at these kind of like author collaboration networks. And this was also very interesting because we found out that actually, for some reason, in the 1960s, there were more female film directors than male film directors in newsreels. And this is also something that we are now digging deeper and kind of like trying to understand why there was this kind of like phenomenon. But what is important here is that after doing these kind of like looking at these different layers of certain geographical mentions or authors, then it's important to kind of like put all these different layers together and try to see if there are certain generic trends. And here, for example, we can see certain, interesting things happening in the 1980s. This is, of course, perestroika, and it's nothing new in a sense for historians to reveal or kind of like understand that there was perestroika. But what was astonishing for me was that so kind of like how profound these changes were, and how kind of like they actually happened in all different layers, and so that was kind of like one interesting finding. Another way to look at this would be, of course, to see what kinds of like if there are certain differences in these dynamics in these different layers. But to conclude this section of this talk, I think that yeah, what we try to do is to kind of like to see whether we can actually, what would be a good way to combine quantitative and qualitative research in historical context. And I think that this is I think that this is not yet perfect, but this kind of like is one step towards that direction. Okay, and now I will continue to the next parts of my presentation, and I will talk about temporal dynamics of visual discourses. So now we will leave all the kind of like the multimodality in the shelf for a while, and now we will focus only on visual discourses. So we extracted basically all the frames from the newsreels, and we have been operating on the central frames of each shot when doing this and the next analysis. So this part of the talk is also just quite recently published. If someone is interested in looking at that. Here, our starting point was kind of like the concept of media realities and the assumption that media has an impact on the way we actually see the world, what we think as important in the world. And we were interested in analyzing what is called visual discourses in the newsreel media. So we were interested in kind of like studying how did the newsreels portray the world in the Soviet Union. This is something that has, of course, been studied earlier. There are maybe two different kinds of approaches here. Some scholars emphasize the immutable and standardized kind of like late Soviet culture, where everything was very ritualistic and so on, while some other scholars have identified certain changes in the visual culture, especially in the 1950s and 1960s. So, and all these studies are based on qualitative analysis, and our attempt was to try to do this quantitatively, or kind of like combining again quantitative and qualitative approaches. So our research questions were, what were the long-term continuities and changes in the Soviet visual discourses, and how can we actually study them computationally? If we look at the current stage of analysis of images, especially in the film history, usually the kind of like the standard way to approach is to somehow recognize and annotate the images either manually or computationally, and as kind of like then analyze the resulting lists of either textual keywords or numerical features, and kind of like this analysis is based on sorting, clustering, and often statistical analysis of these extracted features. However, if the kind of like the approach or the research interest is not kind of like predetermined, kind of like certain narrow topic there, but if the research interest is more to kind of like see what's there and try to kind of like categorize this, then this kind of like more prevailing approach has certain shortcomings, and I call them translation loss, partial view, and emphasis on deduction. So let me explain a bit. So let's kind of like imagine that we have a very simple set of images with circles of different colors, different shapes, and in different positions. And if we want to categorize these, for instance, by color, but not by size or position of the circle, it produces a translation loss. We get to kind of like see something, but other parts of the data are being lost. then if we annotate, for instance, all the blue and orange circles, but kind of not pay attention to green or empty ones, we also get this kind of like partial view. So we again get to see only some part of the data, but not all of that. And this approach also has this emphasis on deduction. So if there is, we can imagine that there is some literature stating that orange for some reason was very important, but no literature on blue or green, then we kind of like overemphasize this importance of orange and forget about blue and green again. So if our goal here is to have this kind of like inductive approach and try to see what historians often kind of like very vaguely call what traces from the data, and not selecting in advance what to focus on, how can we actually then study visual materials? So our approach was to do so-called proto-annotation with machine learning, and then human labeling done by me after that. So we first turned images into multi-dimensional vectors using like ResNet 50. And then we visualize these vectors with the help of two-dimensional projections such as t-SNE and UMAP. To explain a little bit how this works visually, so again, we can go back to this toy dataset of images. And if we would turn these images into multi-dimensional vectors, where actually each visual features are kind of like detected, and then we would use different projections to visualize these different ways the images are similar to each other. So here are two examples of different ways these images can be similar to each other. And playing around with these kinds of like different projections helps us to understand the different ways these images are visually similar to each other. For doing this, we used a collection space navigator, which is a free and open source tool developed by my colleagues at Tallinn University. Here is a link for that if you're interested in looking at it more closely. Here is kind of like the overview of the interface. And here is also a link to kind of like a toy data set, or kind of like here you can play around with the tool by using Estonian newsreel data that we have also been playing around with. So we used this collection space navigator to study temporal dimensions of visual discourses. So this slide you have already seen. So here is a UMAP projection of these central frames of each shot. And as you can see, there are certain kind of like clusters of images that are detected to be as similar to visually similar to each other. So basically, each dot is one frame, and if two dots are close to each other, it means that they are visually similar. But if they are very far away from each other, it means that they are very dissimilar. So we can see that number one, there are at certain place there is kind of like these natural images with the horizon. Then number two, there are a lot of people in meetings. Then number three, then we have close-ups of people in meetings. There were a lot of meetings in the Soviet Union. Then we have close-ups of different people. We have industrial production. We have frames with text, and then we have also city images. And if we zoom in, we can see very interesting continuities. For instance, we can see this kind of like peninsula of of Soviet leaders standing on Lenin Mausoleum year after year after year, always kind of like visually very similar. Only the persons might change there, but always the hats and certain kind of like position in diagonal here, which is kind of like, it already shows some kind of like very interesting continuities and kind of like iconicities in the Soviet newsreels. Then we can also divide these Yuma projections into different temporal dimensions. Here I have divided the Yuma projections first into yearly baskets. The first basket is from 1945 to 1954. As you remember, there were some, scarce data, so that's why this is quite pale. But then if we look at the next basket, which is from 1955 to 54, if I can see correctly, we can see that there is kind of like more data here. So, and then we have two more baskets here, which all of them, as you can see, it is the kind of like the yearly division is not even. So they are selected based on political history of Soviet Union and the leadership changes. And if we look at in the horizontal axis, at the very top level, we have the first scenes of each newsreel issue. And this is very important because the newsreels were kind of like temporally organized in such way that always at the very beginning there were scenes of important political events. In the middle, which is kind of like the middle level here, there were often portrayals of industrial production or agriculture or such things. And in the end, which is the last layer here, they were talking about, or they were showing some sports or art, often ballet, or sometimes even some consumer culture issues. So if we look at this, we can see that there are some important kind of temporal layers and temporal dimensions here. So for instance, if we look at now more closely something that happened during Khrushchev times, there are these two vertical parallel lines of people in meetings. And if we look at this more closely, we can see that this upper level that appeared only during Khrushchev time shows leaders in kind of like very dynamic positions. I can see that there is something in the chat. Yeah, okay. All right. Yeah, so this is very interesting finding, and this is something that is confirmed or confirms kind of findings of earlier research of other scholars. But here we can actually show this also quantitatively, and we can show that this was a specific kind of like cultural phenomenon during Khrushchev time, as these kind of scenes were not as frequent in the later times as they were during Khrushchev times. Now, if we, let me see, yeah. If we continue and look at other types of meetings, we can see that during Khrushchev time, there, or kind of like Khrushchev time, but there was even more and more such portrayals during kind of like later times in Brezhnev time. There was this kind of like meeting table, which is quite interesting phenomenon, and this is something that has not been studied or has not been written about, at least in the literature that I know of. So this is kind of like a new finding, and this is something that I should probably study more. But I kind of like my hypothesis, or the first thoughts about this, is that at certain point in the Soviet media, they wanted to show in a more kind of like these meetings in a more democratic, if you can use this word in the context of Soviet Union, in more democratic ways. So if you compare to the image on the left, that were more kind of like this earlier times ways of showing meetings where there is one person talking and then there is this audience. At certain point, there were also these kinds of like meetings where there are delegations meeting with each other. Then there are some interesting features on close-ups. I will not look into this more closely. Then we have also interesting images on agriculture. These are, of course, kind of like these combine harvesters that are very iconic in the Soviet propaganda. But here, what is interesting is that this kind of like machine learning recognizes that there are certain images that are actually not combine harvesters, but there are other types of visual images of agriculture, and they are from the later time. And it is quite interesting that in a way, although there is this kind of like certain similar features, but these kinds of agricultural scenes started to be used not to show kind of like this fruitful harvest, but more to discuss ecological problems and kind of like water pollution and such things. So there is, we can see also that there is this kind of like thematical change here. And then again, there is this interesting bump on perestroika time. But I will, as I can see that the time is running, so I will skip that part and try to conclude the second part of this this talk. So here we have tried to show that temporal dynamics of visual discourses can be studied computationally by combining machine learning and human interpretation. Here, of course, human interpretation is subjective, but at the same time, this human interpretation can also be informed and to kind of like to contextualize these findings and to determine what is interesting and what is not. So to move on to the last part of this presentation, so now we will switch as kind of like as this in the second part and this Soviet view paper, we were interested in kind of like doing this discourse analysis of visual features and to look at all the data. But now we will switch our focus and we will look at the visual data, but with a very specific focus. So we're trying to detect and measure cultural political phenomenon of Leninism by using large language models. So the starting questions for this study were that we, of course, all of us know that computational methods are very good at detecting certain objects or words or such things. But how about if we are interested in phenomena that are more difficult to determine exactly, and sometimes certain political or cultural phenomena can be even hard to determine exactly for qualitative study. And if we use computation, we of course need to be very precise on what kinds of things we are looking for and trying to detect. So how can we do this? And the question is, of course, then also that to what extent can we detect and measure cultural political phenomena that are temporally changing? And is this possible at all? And where are the boundaries for doing this? And then, of course, we are also testing the limitations and capabilities of large language models in detecting cultural political phenomena. So these are kind of like the starting point of this study here. So this study is in progress. I'm doing this in collaboration with Andres Karius, Tilman Ohm, and Krister Kruusma at Tallinn University. And for this cultural political phenomenon, we have chosen Leninism and how Leninism was portrayed in Novosti Dnya, or this News of the Day newsreel series. We are currently working on the whole bunch of questions, but I think that probably we will end up with two different kinds of papers, a method paper and a history paper, because these are kind of like a little bit different genres of kind of like literature. So I think that we might split this into two different articles. The method paper is aimed for testing and proposing a pipeline for how to detect visual representations of complex cultural phenomena. And the history paper, we want to measure this and explain what we see and what are the possible problems there. So this kind of like division might happen. If we look at the literature on multimodal models to detect complex cultural phenomena, we can see that there are discussions, for instance, on large language models or CLIP models more precisely, to detect universal concepts such as love and family in image data. But our question is then kind of like, how about can we somehow detect more abstract historical and country-specific concepts? Then there are in the literature some discussions on large language models' capabilities to trace abstract concepts in art or detecting visual motives, visual cultural motives such as pietà in moving images. So these are kind of like the starting points that we are relying on and where we are starting our research. A couple of words about Leninism. Earlier studies on Leninism are based on close reading and small visual and textual sources. But based on this, we know that Leninism was a very long-term foundational principle of the Soviet state. And there were certain kinds of changes in Leninism. Stalin referred to Lenin to authorize his leadership. The same was done by Khrushchev in the 1950s. And again, as late as mid-1980s during Perestroika, Lenin was used as a reference to kind of like returning back to the core ideals of communism. Leninism is, of course, quite visual in certain terms. Lenin's image was kind of like emblem and used in many places. And as I mentioned, there was nevertheless certain kind of like, it seems that there were differences in these visual representations during Stalin's time. Lenin was shown always with Stalin. But not all images of Lenin are Leninist. For example, we can think about the orange alternative, Pomarańczowa Alternatywa from the Poland in 1980s, that kind of like use this to, characterize their approach to Soviet or socialist ideals and to make fun of them. Or today, Lenin is still kind of like used at the Cyber Leninka library logo. So kind of like how to then how can we actually detect Leninism if not all Lenin pictures are Leninism? So, but nevertheless, we have started with a very naive approach. First, we have started with the very basic and started to identify Lenins in the newsreel data. So we have tested different models, and we wanted to predict whether there is Lenin or not, and if there is Lenin visible, kind of like whether it is a live Lenin, that is kind of like real footage on living Lenin, or whether it is some kind of like art, a statue or a painting or a poster or such thing. We were also interested in whether Lenin as a mummy or in the laying on the mausoleum is visible there as well, but there was none. So this is also already some kind of like an interesting finding here. So these are very, very raw predictions about the amount of possible Lenin portrayals and their percentage. But this is something that is still kind of ongoing. And the next steps for us is to develop this kind of like what we call Leninism score. So this means that we need to go back to doing the literature review and to look at what is the definition of Leninism, what is the phenomenon that we are interested in, and also kind of like what is the Leninism in different times, because there is this temporal variation. When we have this core understanding of what we are looking for, then we will develop these Leninism questions that we can ask large language models to say yes or no. It can be that whether there is Lenin or not, but there can be also other principles of Leninism, such as kind of like collaboration of the peasants and workers, or other types of things that are core at the kind of like the Leninism or the idea of Leninism. And once we have kind of like gone through all these Leninism questions and yes or no answers for each of these images, then we can count the Leninism score for each image and to kind of like measure the degree of Leninism and perhaps different types of Leninisms as well. So that's where we are right now, and I will just very briefly conclude my whole talk. What I have tried to talk about here is these kind of like core questions that I'm constantly thinking about and trying to find answers from different perspectives. And as kind of like I'm interested in using computational methods together with qualitative analysis to study phenomena through using audiovisual materials. And here, to maybe repeat, I think that at least for me, it has been very important to always start with the question of what is the actual phenomenon that I'm studying? What are the components of that? And what kinds of traces has it left to the data? And then kind of like see, kind of combine these components of the phenomenon under study with the parameters that are available in the data. Because quite often I think that it is we too easily, or at least I have been in previous studies sometimes, too easily taking just some data the most easily available data points there and the most easily available method, and doing something and thinking that that actually represents the phenomenon that I'm studying. But I think that this is something that needs to be kind of like thought more thoroughly. And then, of course, it is important to take into account the historical layers of the data and the multimodality of the data and the phenomena. Then, as I have been here with these different examples, playing around with inductive and deductive approaches. So this is also kind of like something that needs to be thought about. What kind of like approach is something that we need for this particular study. And then, of course, I'm very interested in thinking about what do we measure when we try to understand culture quantitatively, and what new things can we see and what remains unseen? Because, of course, not everything has been digitized, and there are cultural phenomena that actually don't leave many traces. So I think that computationally and studying different historical materials, we can do a lot, but we always must remember that always something remains unseen. So I think this is all that I wanted to share with you. And